I'm Kathryn Taylor, and I'm here to read you another chapter in Misty's Misadventures, the rom-com romantic comedy that I've written. And you can see a picture of Misty behind me there, and she's a wonderful, fun-loving young mother who's dealing with a few hard knocks in life. Chapters 1 and 2, we found her returning to Newfoundland to live in a small place called Charlie's Cove, and her great uncle died and left her a monstrosity of a house, which she's trying to manage and figure out how she and her 2 children are going to survive and prosper, perhaps. Now, with each of my chapters, I always named them, which helped me when I wrote them. And this particular one is called Mouldy Old Socks. I know, hey? Any idea? Well, we'll find out. Here we go. 3 heavy thumps on the front door roused Misty from her sleep. Her hips ached from lying on the floor in her sleeping bag. What time was it? She looked at her watch. Only 6 a.m.? The banging on the door continued. "Just a minute," she called as she extracted herself from between Liberty and Vivian. Sweet Jesus, it's cold. She picked up the sweater she had discarded in the night and pulled it on as she padded to the front door. "Who is it?" she asked as she cracked the door enough to peek out. "Morning, missus. Hayward tells me you need some help with the heating." Duff. Go figure. What time do you normally get up around here?" was all Misty could think to ask. "Same time as the sun. I've been up and chopped some wood. You wants I brings it in?" Duff's breath was clouding in the cool morning air. Behind him, she could see the infamous sun shining brilliantly in an almost cloudless sky, as blue as ever she had seen, and she was struck by the sound of birds chirping. The day was alive in ways that she would need at least 2 hours and a strong cup of coffee to appreciate. Despite the beauty and the freshness of the day, the coolness in the air hadn't improved much overnight. The girls would be up in a few hours, and it would help if the house was warm. Oh, maybe these old homes are like large live-in refrigerators, thought Misty. Did they even use insulation when they built them? My gosh, if Charlie was 95, then this house could be, well, maybe 75 years old? Oh, she gave herself a mental slap. This path of thought was a poor way to start the day. Better to welcome in a man who was willing to help her with heating, primitive though it might be. Misty nodded for Duff to get started. She left the door ajar and jumped back into her sleeping bag, careful not to wake the girls. A few minutes later, Duff traipsed across the room and began carefully stacking wood next to the stove. "How about I lights it and get some heat going?" he whispered. "I promise the whole house won't burn down?" "This place? I can fix that for you too if it's what you wants." A mischievous grin transformed his face, giving him the appearance of a demonic elf. "Oh, well, thanks for the offer, but at the moment, this place is the only piece of heaven we have." "Right on," Duff agreed as he placed the wood in the stove. "I seen worse, and I seen lots better. She's what we calls a fixer-upper of the 3rd degree, 1 and 2 being preferable by far." As she watched Duff, Misty wondered how she was going to cope. She had no idea how to use a wood stove. "Think you can teach me how to do that?" she whispered dubiously. "Yes, my love. You'll manage once we gets the wood in." Misty wished she shared his optimism. She glanced at her hands and wondered how long her nails and how long they would hold up, and if there'd be any point at all to ever have another manicure in her life. If they were going to survive, she would have to shake her strong desire to hide in the bottom of her sleeping bag and pretend this was all a dream. Broken nails are a temporary drawback. Happy, warm children are what count. She could and would do whatever it took to keep her family together. Once the stove was lit, Duff continued to carry stacks of wood into the house. The logs crackled and popped, and the smell reminded Misty of moldy old socks. She asked Duff if he thought the same thing. "Well, yes, by. Hung nar socks over the wood stove in me days. Surprised you'd think of that, though, young ting like you and from the city, too." Misty felt her sensory experience would make absolutely no sense to anyone who had never experienced wool socks drying over a stove, and the fact Duff understood filled her with a new respect for him. She set about to tap his considerable knowledge. "How'd you know I'm from the city?" she asked. "Hayward." To his credit, Duff seemed a bit embarrassed. What else had Hayward told him? Her financial and marital status? Whatever happened to client confidentiality? Most folks could put two and two together, but still, Hayward might have shown a bit more discretion than that. Misty gave her head a shake. What planet was she on? Even her very short introduction to Hayward left her feeling that he and discretion were polar opposites. She noticed their conversation had come to a halt at the mention of Hayward. So she picked up the thread and continued. "Well, we had our weekends around the bay, and Dad always kept a camp. There were times I thought I'd lose my toes to frostbite. We were so wet and cold from playing by the shore." She paused and looked at the wood crackling in the stove, wondering once again how on earth she was going to manage. "How often do I add wood?" "Few times a day. You'll be rising to do the same if you wants heat in the mornings." Misty panicked at the thought of being chained to a wood stove. She was going to need a job, and fast. A furnace would be an absolute necessity by October. September even, if these cool temperatures were any indication. She fell back on her sleeping bag and moaned. 12 months ago, her definition of a necessity would have been thong panties, an underwired bra, and a glass of wine. Things had changed pretty damn fast. "That bother you, missus?" "Bother me? Oh, what could possibly be bothersome about loading wood in a stove several times a day?" she said, her voice weighted with sarcasm. Duff shook his head as he watched her wiggle out of the sleeping bag. "Likes camping, do ye?" "Hardly. This floor is more a matter of not liking the look of the beds." She held up her hand as he started to reply. No, wait. Don't stop me," she said as she looked around. "Just look at this place. What am I supposed to do? This house is old. Everything in it is old. For that matter, I'm starting to feel old. My back is shot from sleeping on the floor for just one night. Oops, forgive me. Where are my manners? I could just morph into Debbie Travers and turn this place into a palace if I had a budget and a lot more imagination." She dug around for her flip-flops and found them under her sleeping bag. As she shoved her feet into them, she turned to Duff and threw up her arms in exasperation. "I don't mean to complain. I'm not really like that, but what am I supposed to do?" Her voice was shrill by the time she finished, and the girls were shifting restlessly in their sleeping bags. Luckily, they were sound sleepers. She realized she was only one step away from breaking down in front of a total stranger. And she, the expert in crisis management. A fine example she was setting. "Well, was hoping you'd ask." "What?" Misty said a tad too sharply. She narrowed her eyes and tilted her head, rather like a dog trying to decipher human conversation. "Well, was hoping you'd ask," he repeated with a warm smile. And even though Misty decided she liked that grin much better than the demonic one, she plunged on with her reckless outburst. Well, that's just the point. I can't ask. She took her frustration out on the sleeping bag as she stuffed it into the small sack that was provided for its containment and never quite managed to hold it. It's not like it sounds. I'm not too proud to admit I need help. I could use it right now. She continued to fight with the bag and finally gave up and tossed it into the corner, its contents partially spilling out over the floor. Look at that, she pointed at it. That's a perfect example of what I feel like, trying to do the impossible. I appreciate your offer, I really do, but I just don't have any extra money right now. Sounds about right, Duff said, undaunted. He had an unusual habit of sucking saliva through his teeth, which he used to punctuate most of what he said. What does? She looked over to where Liberty and Vivian were beginning to stir, grateful the room had warmed up rapidly. Well, I'll help you, and you can make it up when you get work. Well, I can't do... Go on and shut your gob. He dismissed her objections with a wave of his hand. Just tell me what you want's done first. For the first time in several minutes, she was speechless. Truly, she couldn't expect this man to work for nothing, and the chances of her getting a job in this pee-hole were probably slim to none. I don't take charity. I've managed this far, and I'll figure it out, somehow. Her frustration was thinly veiled, and she felt certain he knew it. What she really wanted to say was, thank you, and when can you start? It's not the way you thinks it is around here. I offers my services, and I finds it insulting that you thinks it's charity. I knows money is tight, and like I said, you can pay me when you gets a job. Misty paused and looked at him. You're serious, aren't you? You do that for us? For complete strangers? You isn't strangers, missus. You're Charlie's kin. Now, where does ya want to start? Misty led Duff up the stairs and into the first of 3 bedrooms. She pointed at the bed. That's got to go? And there's 2 more in the other rooms. Right. Need some help with that, he said. Then he turned around, walked back down the stairs, and out the front door. No goodbyes or anything of that nature. Apparently, Duff could be a man of few words when he wanted to be. Misty looked at her watch. It was only 7:30, and she felt as though she'd lived through a day already. She was still uncomfortable with Duff's generous offer, but maybe that's the way things were done in Charlie's Cove. And that comment about being Charlie's kin, what was up with that? She'd never even been to visit Charlie. The fact her life was beginning to resemble an episode of the Beverly Hillbillies wasn't lost on her. But because she couldn't think of any other solution, she shut off the mental verbiage and decided to have a shower and get dressed. The way Duff operated, it wouldn't be long before he'd be back with help. And besides, with the heating situation temporarily under control, she had a new problem: hunting up 12 easy installments on a trio of beds had just moved to the top of her to-do list. End of chapter 3, Moldy Old Socks. So now you know what moldy old socks are. They are wool socks drying over a stove, and the smell of damp wool as it dries is a very unique smell. If you've never smelled it, well, moldy old socks is a half-decent description for it. And there are many things about life in Newfoundland and things that Misty is going to learn over the next little while that are unique, and maybe will come back to her as ideas and memories of her childhood. We'll certainly see. And for those of you who've never visited Newfoundland, our outports are very, very amazing, beautiful, and interesting places. Back when Charlie's Cove would have been developed, Many of the houses were built with the bare necessities. They didn't have a lot of insulation. They didn't have the windows we have today. Things were pretty basic, and, and these houses were drafty, and much of the life centered around the kitchen because that was where a lot of the heat, the food, and so on was, and that was where people gravitated. When they went to bed, they'd have the heat on, and as the night went on, the house would cool, so they'd have layers of warm blankets and probably quilts that they made. And then in the morning, the heat did not come back until that wood stove was stoked. So you can kind of understand why Misty is panicking, feeling like she's going to be trapped to a wood stove, constantly feeding wood in, and no end in sight. So that's not something you're used to if you're coming from where she came from a city where basically there's a thermostat on the wall and you turn it on and you have heat. So indeed, things are different. Everything from moving the wood to maintaining your nails. It's really going to be a challenge for her. So it's kind of fun to see her. She's a bit of a fish out of water, as we say. And I'm sure that she'll find her resources, but we shall see. Any questions you have about Newfoundland, don't forget to ask. I'm trying to paint a picture for you to take with you and perhaps to encourage you to sometime consider a vacation here when you can. Newfoundland's such a beautiful place. I hope you enjoyed the reading today and see you again soon for chapter 4, which is called Bed Knobs and Broomsticks. Bye for now.